get started back again here, talking about my favorite subject, manure. I bet it's something that you deal with a lot if you're a dairy farmer, custom applicator, or other. And today I always try to think of something different to highlight at this meeting in regards to manure. And some of the information you hear might be something you've heard before, but I want to take it in a new direction and talk about how different technologies, innovations on farm affect your manure in different ways. And some of these things you might not have really thought about before. And I always want to start it by talking about agronomics, and there's a reason for that. You guys hear in your nutrient management plan and everything else, we always talk about agronomic rate. What is that? Something you're supposed to be dealing with. And by definition, it's the application of nutrients. Primarily, we always focus on nitrogen, sometimes phosphorus, to supply crop nutrient needs and achieve realistic yields, minimize the movement of nutrients to natural resources, that being air, water, groundwater, etc. Right? That makes sense. Put on what your crop needs when your crop needs it, thinking about all those other factors. And in essence, a simplistic model of that is to say that the manure nutrients applied equal what is already available in the soil minus the plant needs, and that's what you should be putting on. The hardest part about this little equation here is figuring out the manure nutrients applied. Manure is really complicated. It's shifty, it's everywhere, it's volatile, it mixes, it mines, it changes, it in the soil, it has to be converted. So it can actually be a lot more complicated and sophisticated than we give it credit for. I'm always a proponent of bringing value and respect back to that product so that you utilize it a lot better and think about it in a different way. Hopefully it's one of the better things that you produce on your farm, and you can really think of it that way. You get a lot of free manure, free fertilizer by making milk. So think about it that way, and we can use it that way. So when we're using manure, there's a few things that we need to consider in that context that are really valuable and really important. The first one is to think about your manure type. So manure type makes a difference, solid versus liquid, and I'm going to get into manure type even more so. It has its own dedicated slide that it has such an impact in this equation and your calculation and how you're going to utilize the product. But even our different livestock species, even within that, breeds have a little bit different manure type and texture that comes out. Technology impacts to the composition of that manure. So how you're treating that manure on farm, what that looks like, how that affects it. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more. The manure nutrient concentration, this is really, really important to think about. This is going to change throughout the year. It's going to change in your storage based on dilution effects from rainwater that's collected or from evaporation at different times of the year. You're going to have thinner manure this time of year because you've collected a lot of water. You're going to have thicker manure in the summer because you're not collecting water. You really, really, really have to account for that. And that thick versus thin is not just a nutrient concentration differential, but it's a processing concentration differential too, right? Thick manure can be more challenging with equipment than thin manure can be. So something to consider too, that you can use this dilution effect to your advantage, but you always need to consider it. One of the ways that you consider that is by testing it, evaluating it throughout the year, and knowing approximately how it changes on a year-to-year basis. The reason we want to think about that is nutrient availability is also really important. So what you put out isn't necessarily what's going to be available to the plant. And it certainly isn't going to be available the day that you put it out necessarily. There's a lot of changes that are also going to happen in that manure product throughout the year. So the nutrient availability essentially means when will that nutrient be available based on the conversion rate in soil. So if you remember this from other talks I've given, manure has essentially about half organic nitrogen and half ammonium nitrogen. By and large, your crops, especially grass, wants nitrate. There's no nitrate in your manure product. What you put out has to be converted in the soil into that plant available form of nitrogen, a nitrate form. So how long it takes to break down these nitrogen products. Ammonium nitrogen, pretty quick. If you want to go all the way back to high school chemistry class and think about that nitrogen cycle, by the way, I had to print that out, put it on my wall. I use it that much these days. But thinking that through, to go from ammonium nitrogen to nitrates pretty quick and easy. So that part's available. That organic nitrogen takes a while. You have to have very healthy soils. They have to be in a prime state. What Gabe talked about earlier, if you're too wet or too dry, those microbes are going to shut down. If it's too hot or too cold, they're going to shut down. You have this kind of optimal window of temperature, and luckily where we live in this part of the country, we hit that most of the year. We don't get super hot or super cold for very long if that happens at all. So we get a lot of conversion. It's going to slow down when it's cold. It's going to slow down when it's really hot, but when you apply, especially this time of year, it takes a little bit of time for that nutrient to become available. One thing that I'm a proponent of on soils that can take it is getting manure out, thick manure out, as soon as you possibly can in the year, because it takes a little while, and that's obviously getting out when it's really safe and we don't have runoff issues and your soil can take it and you're not going to have compaction and so on and so forth. But if we can get that out, then our soil microbes are going to turn it over about the same rate that your grass growth curve starts about this time of year, right? So you know it, it's like it takes forever, and then suddenly you get a little warming, days get a little longer, and swoop, there goes that grass growth, and you're cutting and you're going for it in those first few months. Occasionally you can get out, and then we have a huge weather window that prevents anyone from getting out. Sometimes you miss that sweet spot of getting manure out to match that growth curve. It's really, really hard. It's not easy. Chemical fertilizer, you put it out, it's available, boom. That's great, that's easy. But chemical fertilizer is also missing all of the huge, wonderful benefits that manure has by providing micro and macronutrients and organic matter and everything else that's really, really valuable to your soil and to building up your tilth of your soil and your water infiltration, etc. I could go on and on about the benefits of manure, but it's that nutrient availability that's a little challenging. And I'm going to continue this presentation to talk about how your technology and handling will affect that as well and get a little bit more in depth. Another factor to think about is nutrient losses. So what you put out there, even if we can think about the chemistry and conversion in the soil, that's not always what's going to be there. You have innate losses that you can do a decent job controlling with technologies and application rates, etc. But volatilization, meaning you get nitrogen loss that goes as ammonia from the manure up into the air that's lost. You might get denitrification, so you're going to have a conversion of some of that nitrogen over into denitrification that's lost as nitrogen gas. You'll lose a little bit of that. You may have a little leaching. If timing's wrong or irrigation's high or rain is high, you may have some nitrogen that gets lost with the profile below the rooting depth. You may have some that runs off. There's mineralization and mobilization. In other words, the soil may grab some of that nitrogen and hang on to it and won't let it back to you for a long time. So there's ways we can, especially nitrogen. Phosphorus is a lot simpler. It doesn't volatilize or leach really. Mostly we get runoff losses. It's a little bit simpler, but something like nitrogen is you're just squeezing it out all over the place. It takes a lot of work to corral it and keep it, but it's one of your most valuable nutrients in your manure for your crops. It's what you think about probably the most when you're doing your agronomics and your balance, or you're thinking about what do I need to test and look at. It's always nitrogen. It's because it converts all over the place. It's really slippery, but it's a really valuable nutrient that you have. Things like potassium, etc., it doesn't move neither. That's why you can really have issues with uptake or too much uptake of your grass with potassium. And then we've got some herd health issues feeding that back. So each nutrient has its own little loss pathways and conversion and availability. We want to think of all that. We tend to, and I will also focus quite a bit on that nitrogen fraction though. And then lastly, when we're thinking about manure use considerations, of course, is crop type. You guys know this, that each crop requires a little bit different nutrient profile. That NPK, if you will, ratio that you're looking for. If you're applying always at nitrogen levels, the challenging part with manure is that when we apply nitrogen levels to many of our crops, things like grass in particular, oftentimes we're over applying phosphorus because of the natural balance. But maybe technology can help us in changing that balance so we can customize that manure a little bit more. Different things, corn's going to be a little bit different. You can watch your soils build up in certain nutrients, as I mentioned. That's also important. If we get too high in phosphorus from a planting perspective, you don't want to see that loss pathway. So now we're going to start applying phosphorus levels. How do you use manure when, to get your nitrogen value when you always know phosphorus is going to be higher? Again, that's something we can think about through technology and how we're utilizing that manure, what fraction of it, what technologies to put out. So there's a lot of ways that all of these very challenging things that we're dealing with, you have some things that are in your control and some things that are out of your control. I also want to touch on the manure consistency part another time because this is really, really valuable, and because dairy producers, you are required to test your manure. So you might as well do it in a way that's going to be valuable to you. So thinking this through, and again, this is probably pretty obvious to you, but I want you to think about it, which is why I made a special slide, is that you're going to be utilizing your manure spring, summer, fall, not necessarily in the winter. And we have these two fractions here. The blue is water, and the orange is nutrient. This is just a general example. This isn't perfect, but it's pretty close to a lot of our representation. Then in the spring, if we have, our natural balance that we have, and this is saying your cows, same diet year-round, same output on the daily, it's all going into storage. Right about now, as I mentioned earlier, you have a lot of water and a little bit of nutrient. That's your balance on a 1,000-gallon kind of box, if you will. So if we've got about 5 pounds of nitrogen there, in the summer, we're going to have a much more balance, right? We're not getting rainwater into that system. So now you want to think about that same 1,000 gallons, you've got about 15 pounds of nitrogen now. It's gone up on the same volume, and even more so in the fall. We still have a little bit of spring rain in the summer, but by fall, if we've had a few dry months, you can now be up to 20 pounds of nitrogen per 1,000 gallons. So now you're shifting because there's a lot less water. It's a thicker, more concentrated product. So if you just always go out and put, 10,000 gallons per acre all year round, no matter what, that's how it rolls, you're way undersupplying nutrients in the early season, and you're way oversupplying in the late season. I know manure is challenging in that we want to get higher concentration, low volume out now, and vice versa in the fall, but that is not the product that Mother Nature provides you, and it can be really challenging. But that's kind of what we're going for. So your profile is typically inverse to what we actually want to get out there to match something like a grass growth needs, that it's really high needs in the springtime, it's much lower needs in the fall while it's starting to go dormant, and we still have a lot of conversion, and we can have a lot of loss rate. So a little bit challenging, but if you're going to test your manure, I want you to have a spring, summer, and fall test. If you only take one test a year, take in the spring this year, take in the spring the year after, and the fall the year after, knowing that your rainfall is going to be approximately the same as long as your cows and diet don't change much at all. Then you can at least have an idea about how that's going. I will give you a little bit of information later in this presentation, though, about how technologies are evolving to do that in real time. Because I also realize getting a lagoon sample before you apply is the best thing to do, but it can also be a little bit challenging. So there's ways that we can work around that to give you kind of an idea of what's happening, and then kind of change that for real time and what's going on. So when we think about this agronomic variables, and we're thinking about what we control and what we can't control, and how that affects what you're going to do with your manure and how you interact with your manure, there's a few things that are important. Number one, the weather is totally out of your control. As much as I would love, if I had a superpower, it might be that I could control the weather. And then you could each pay me to say, hey, I need a window. Just kidding. But that'd be awesome. You can't control the weather. But what you can, and you can't control your field conditions, you can't control that manure conversion and nutrient availability, as I mentioned, your crop uptake and yield, but you can control your application timing associated with the weather. So that the weather is going to do what it's going to do, but you can use tools and figure out, okay, I can get my manure out around that so that I can control what goes out and how much goes out. And for those field conditions, so you can't control, the saturation rate or various things, maybe just a little bit, but it's challenging. you, but you can control how much manure you put out. What is that application rate to accommodate those soil conditions? You can't control that manure conversion, but the characteristics to some degree of your manure you certainly can, so that you can use different components of your manure. You can modify it a little bit to get closer to working with the soil and the weather and those other conditions. And then that crop uptake and yield, you can't control, but you certainly can control what type of crop is out there and how many acres, so that you can have an idea of what you need to hit your balance. You can't control your soil type, but you can certainly control what you know about it. So you're here today to increase your knowledge, to adapt to those things you can't control, to work with them rather than working against them and being frustrated. And lastly, you can't control the fact you don't have manure unless you want to get rid of all your cows, but let's just say you love manure and you have it. So what we can do is modify and control the equipment and the technology, how you're working with that manure, and how you're going to adapt to some of these other things by adapting your equipment and your technology. When we start applying technologies to manure, and by technologies, I mean manure storage is a technology. Manure application equipment is a technology. A digester is a technology. A solid separator, dryer, all those things are technically technologies. What you do change there is that you increase your testing needs because you're modifying it. It's not what comes out of the cow anymore. It's a little bit different. So when we think about the fact that our cows produce manure and manure goes out on the field, and that's pretty simple, right? It's not that case. When you start putting technologies, it's going to change that. Now you've got solid and liquid fractions, and you've got compost and manure that's totally different than what came out of that cow, or you've got a 6-month holding time versus a 1-month holding time, and so on and so forth. You really have to adapt and consider that nutrient balance, that consistency and handling, all of these things change quite a bit when we start messing with manure. And you may not think about that right now. You might be doing the things you're doing because it's convenient, it's easy, it makes your processing a lot simpler, but you've totally changed that product, and you should take advantage of what you've done to it to work for you a little bit better, to work for your fields, your crops, your timing, your technology, and so on. There's a lot there. So let's think about how to change your manure texture and chemistry. So here's a few things I mentioned. No modification means that manure goes straight from the barn to the field, or you're grazing your animals. That's no technology. They're pooping direct on your field, and there it is. So what comes out of that cow is what went on your field. That's a perfect little equation. Storage changes our profile, as I mentioned that. So storage is actually a manure storage. So you collect it out of the barns, maybe a short time holding tank, and then it goes into a lagoon or an upright storage tank or something else where it's being stored. You might scrape into slurry and pile it and store it there as well. You're changing it. Now that manure, which is almost like, or your lagoon is a bit like a rumen in some degrees. You've got this anaerobic environment full of bacteria that are acting on fibers and nutrients and various things, and they're bubbling gas, and they're changing things and converting your nitrogen fractions, carbon fractions, and all sorts of stuff. And when you let it just sit there for a while, the product that went in is not the product that came out. If you have 6 months of storage in hot weather and cold weather, totally different. So not just timing. Hot weather really increases all that bacterial function. Same thing that's happening in your soil is happening in your lagoon. Cold weather slows it all down. You're going to retain things a little more. Thick versus thin that goes in that storage makes a difference as well. So it's really surprisingly complicated. You get stratification. So if you're pulling off the top versus the bottom of that storage, completely different product. So that's why a lot of you will agitate or stir it up so you get more consistency with what you're going out. Some know what that stratification is and use it to your advantage by getting thick or thin manure when you need it. It's a great way to use that. So storage is a really great technology that you are using to modify your manure. It's changing while it's in there, and you can use that to your advantage. Water collection into your storage, you're diluting that manure. So we always want you, and you also want to collect as little water as you can to maximize your storage. but I also see it as you're maximizing your manure. I want as little water in there as possible so that the product you have is thick and lovely when you need it. You can add water to it as a technology change when you want to control the thinning rate of it, maybe later in the year. So really think about water collection into there, and then when we dilute that manure, again, it changes the bacteria in there and its action in the conversion, not just your nutrients per volume. There's more happening in there. When you use a solid separator, so now you split liquid and solid fractions, that's pretty cool. Now you have completely different nutrient profiles in those two products. So you have removed in the solids some of that organic nitrogen phosphorus fraction, and now you can use that completely differently, as you will, than that liquid fraction that went in. That liquid fraction now has a very different nutrient profile than it did before it was separated. So even that solid separation, again, you may use it to export solids, to use solids as bedding and so on, but that liquid fraction that's going in is different now. You modified it to use it easier through equipment to change its nutrient profile to have a higher nitrogen content. So a little bit different change. Something like composting or stockpiling it, this is also going to change. You're removing nutrients. When you just let manure sit, you're letting, it's volatilizing, it's losing fractions of it up into the air. So that is also a way to break it down, to dry it, to change that product. Again, it's more stable, and it's going to be applied very differently than had you just left it in that liquid fraction form. And then something like a digester is going to just break everything up completely. You're taking out carbon, you're making nitrogen more available, you're changing the whole entire profile of that, you're adding things to it. Very, very different. And then there's a whole host of other technologies that are coming up online, which are great. And you might think of some of those things to solve an end problem, but don't forget about what's in the middle. The manure that comes out of whatever you're doing to it is really, really important. We now have ways that folks are separating out the nitrogen from the phosphorus and then custom blending it back together. That's a very high-tech way to separate and then reconstitute manure to a product that really you can manipulate and use to your advantage. So there's all sorts of ways you can do it, but just remember, something as simple as just storing it is changing it. Think about it. If you want to experiment with that a little bit more, I'm more than happy to talk to people about what stratification, what happens with water or no water, or heat, or if you leave it longer or you leave it less, all of those things. You're doing a lot to change your manure. And then we think about, okay, so now you've stored it in some way. Now you want to get it out on your field, and how's technology changing that? Well, in general, a few things to think about that, as I mentioned earlier, we somehow want to get thick manure out early season, thin in the late season. And again, this is because the less volume you get out, your soil has less holding capacity and a greater chance of saturation for runoff. So if you get thicker manure, in other words, higher nitrogen or nutrient content, less volume, you're going to get a better chance of having less issues with runoff. In late season, you want to get the water out there to maybe use that as part of your irrigation offset, but you don't need a ton of nutrients. There's plenty in your soil, most likely, that's built up over the season and it's become available from previous years. You also want to get manure as close to the ground as you possibly can. Reduce its air time. When manure is exposed to the air, it's also volatilizing. You are losing nitrogen, you're exposing it to the air's odor output, all sorts of things. We want to make sure it's on the soil, into the profile as fast as possible. And you also want to use equipment with the largest droplet size. This again is to minimize air time. A big droplet has this much air, but if you broke that up and you had tons of little droplets, you've multiplied by about 1,000 times in what is exposure to the air and how much you're losing to evaporation and volatilization losses, etc. And lastly, incorporating it as soon as possible, whatever you do, whether this be a manual, you're tilling it in, you're harrowing grazed manure, you're irrigating over your manure, or you're letting rain, a little bit of rain, not too much, infiltrate that manure off of that leaf surface and into the soil, you are saving and utilizing all your nutrients so much better. You're keeping that balance where you want it so that you're keeping that nitrogen balanced with the phosphorus. We start volatilizing and losing nitrogen, your phosphorus application and potassium application is much higher than you expected, you're totally out of balance. So we want to keep that nitrogen the best we can to keep that natural balance of the product that you've got. So some pros and cons of the most common types of manure application equipment. Big gun, this is probably the worst thing you can use as far as a nitrogen nutrient loss. I realize why. It's inexpensive, it's less compaction and so on, but we have that huge droplet spray. You're exposing all your manure to the air. You're losing a lot of nitrogen and throwing your nutrient profile out of whack. You also have a higher risk of drift, of loss. It's far less precise of where you're putting it, and it's harder to do your agronomic calculations by knowing exactly what you put on, what you didn't lose, and so on. And a tanker truck, so if we're putting it in a tank and hauling it somewhere, depending on what that output is, that's fine, but now you've increased, let's say, fuel use. So now we're in this other category of thinking about how much carbon are we using to move our manure around. But you can apply really thick manure. So with our big gun sprinkler, we need a thinner product to get it out. A tanker, if you've got a really thick product, this is going to be a little bit more friendly to get that out. A drag hose is somewhere in the middle, right? So drag hose is wonderful in that you can really do a lot of work. You can get a thicker product out. You have a smaller footprint, but you have the infrastructure, obviously, to do that. But if you can get a pan, a spray that is thick and low and not very wide, that's perfect. That's one of the best manure applications we can get, particularly for grass. We want it to just get right below that canopy into the soil surface. And it's probably the best way that you can gauge application. You can put an inline meter on there so you know exactly how much went out, when it went out, where it went out. You can track it a lot better. It's much better for precision. Injection, of course, is the best method we can do. That means you're getting that manure right into the soil. It's not exposed to the air surface for losses. That's going to be on something like farm ground. That's going to be really hard to do without ripping up a grass field, right? So some of these are very crop specific. And then you've got a solid manure spreader that's just going to fling that solid stuff out, which is okay, as long as you have that a bit calibrated. So you're not having a big volatilization loss on solids. They're usually a lot more secure with that nutrient profile. They're a little tied up. And then grazing is the same. Again, you've got direct piles. You want to make sure you get that spread out. So grazing is a manure application method. It's just a direct one. So don't forget that. We don't put that in a different area. So it's just a way to think through, how am I getting my manure out with that equipment? How is the product ahead of that I'm putting out there to start with? Was it thin? Was it thick? Was it solids? Was it liquids? Was it liquids that were really dilute, liquids that have been held for a while? Or were they really fresh? It's just a month worth in the lagoon. Thinking that through is great to think about what is that nutrient profile I'm actually putting out. That's another reason we don't want you to just test your lagoon, but I want you to test what actually made it to the field, per se. What actually got out there. Or you can't test the cow and expect that to match what you put out at any time of the year. It's really variable. It changes quite a bit. One of the kind of cool inline technologies, John Deere, and I'm not supporting John Deere, I'm just saying they're the only ones that come up with something so far of a dream that I would love to see everybody have, is that you can now do inline nutrient testing. I believe this came out about last September, October of last year, that they can now, I haven't seen it in action, but record nitrogen, ammonium, phosphate, potassium, and dry matter in line while they're applying manure, which is awesome, right? Then you can speed up, slow down to accommodate if you're emptying your lagoon, that if you have that stratification or that change, you can really customize now your manure application rate. We've never respected manure to this level, and no one's ever, I think, respected it enough to create something like this, a technology to make manure this precision level, and it deserves this kind of respect. It's one of the best products we can put out. So I'm glad to see these technologies are coming out. This reduces your lab sampling, increases accuracy. It's a pretty cool methodology. So I'm curious if you do have one of these, please see me out. You do? Yeah. Are you a custom applicator? Excellent. That was even better. Cool. And is it working for you? Yes. See that guy if you need manure put out. But actually, no, seriously, that's the best. If custom guys have it and you can get this direct response, you don't even need to do manure testing ahead of time. If he's telling you what it is as you go along, you can get the GPS tracking and look at that. You can see how your crop response was and adjust it the next go or the next year. That's really cool. So I'd love to actually talk with you more about how it's working and see how that works. Does anyone else have one of these? Okay, well, he's winning so far. Anyway, this would be pretty cool to see how this works. Maybe we'll have a field day at some point in this next year if this is working really well. I would love to see more adoption of this kind of technology. So just in closing, to kind of wrap it up, general considerations that you can think of. Again, you're all extremely inventive. You know your product, you know what's going on, and I know you can adapt a lot of concepts to match what's going on your farm, but you can always call me if you want to talk about ideas or riff off of this stuff, you want some guidance. I love talking shit. Sorry, I had to say it. So feel free, but just think about your manure type, your soil type, your crop type, your expected yield, maybe what you're getting, adapting that throughout the year, and putting your application rate with that. Lot to consider, but if anything, really, really think about your manure and the value there. And then using your equipment. If you have the ability to use a custom applicator or you have equipment of your own, really then if you have equipment of your own, you can really tinker, touch it, get it, the nozzles right, the spray right, the volume, the down, the this. You can really adjust what you have to get it to maximize what that nutrient compound or composition that you want and you want to retain in your product, and then time that. Use the weather to your advantage. Use your irrigation to your advantage with your manure application, and you can really make a much better product, get it better in your crops, and your crop yields might just be much better for quality and quantity than you expect when you really start thinking about your manure in this way. So with that, I will just leave. I know I showed you this before, but that's really, 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 really thinking about all of these pieces here. When you're thinking about how does your manure roll into that, it always starts with that agronomic rate. What's your manure composition and how you roll with that, and then all the other tools follow from there. So it's a great first step always to think about.